step aside. You're flagged in our system." The words sliced through the noise of Concourse C like a blade. Renee Ashworth stood at the gate counter boarding pass, trembling slightly in her hand, not from fear, but from the effort of holding herself together. Her name glowed red across the agent's screen. Restricted. Around her, the terminal seemed to shrink, every conversation dying mid-sentence as heads turned. "Ma'am, I need you to step to the side," the gate agent repeated, voice tight with practiced neutrality that didn't quite hide her nerves. Renee didn't argue. She'd learned long ago that arguing only made strangers more certain you were guilty of something. She stepped aside, jaw set, eyes forward, while a supervisor was summoned and 2 airport security officers drifted toward the gate, hands resting near their belts, not quite touching anything yet. "Ms. Ashworth," the supervisor's voice carried across the boarding area louder than it needed to be. "Our system shows you're on a federal aviation restriction list. I'll need to verify your documentation before we can proceed." Whispers rippled outward. A man lowered his phone, filming without pretending not to. A mother pulled her son back a full step, as if whatever Renee had done might be contagious. Renee reached into her bag with slow, deliberate movements. She'd learned that too, moving carefully around people who were already afraid of her, and produced a folder of legal paperwork, an emergency exemption. Weeks of her lawyer's fighting condensed into a single manila folder, granting her clearance for exactly 1 flight. She was flying to bury her father. That was all anyone needed to know. It was also the only thing she was allowed to say. The supervisor made a call, then another, scanning documents against a database that clearly wasn't giving him the answer he expected. Minutes crawled by while 40 strangers watched her like she might do something dangerous simply by existing near an airplane. Finally, reluctantly, he handed back her paperwork. "You're cleared. 1 flight. You'll board last, seat in the rear, under crew observation the entire time. Any deviation, and we divert, and you're taken into custody. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Renee said quietly. She had once commanded a squadron of fighter jets over hostile skies. Today, she would board a commercial airliner like a criminal, walk past 100 judging eyes, and take her seat in silence, carrying a secret that, in a few hours, would change everything. "Before we begin, comment where you're watching from." Where? Renee boarded last, exactly as instructed, escorted by a gate agent who kept a careful half-step behind her the entire way down the jet bridge. Passengers already seated watched her walk the aisle, some staring openly, others suddenly fascinated by their phones. A little girl in row 12 tugged her mother's sleeve and asked in the piercing voice only children have, "Mommy, why does that lady need a guard?" Her mother shushed her fast and looked away. Renee kept her eyes forward, spine straight, and found her assigned seat, 34E. Tucked near the rear galley, close enough to the lavatories that she caught the smell of disinfectant every time the door swung open. She settled in, buckled her belt, and folded her hands in her lap like she'd done it 1,000 times before. She had. Just never like this. The flight attendant working the back galley introduced herself as Dana. Mid-30s, efficient, kind eyes that flicked toward Renee only once before she busied herself with the safety demonstration. If Dana had heard anything about the woman in 34E, she didn't show it. Renee was 41 years old, dressed simply in dark jeans and a black jacket, unremarkable by any measure except for the way she watched things. She noted the exact number of exit rows without meaning to. She counted the seconds between the safety briefing and pushback. She listened to the engines spool with an attentiveness that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with habit. A habit 14 years in fighter cockpits had never quite let her shake. She was flying to Newark. Her father had died 4 days ago, quietly, in a hospital room she hadn't reached in time. The funeral was tomorrow morning. That single fact was the only thing that had gotten her through the humiliation at the gate, the certainty that missing it wasn't an option, restriction list or not. As the plane taxied, Dana passed through the cabin one final time, checking seatbelts. She paused briefly at 34E. "First time flying with us?" she asked kindly, clearly unaware of the scene at the gate 20 minutes earlier. "Something like that," Renee said, offering a small, practiced smile. Dana moved on, and Renee turned toward the window, watching the runway lights blur as the aircraft gathered speed and lifted into the gray morning sky. She closed her eyes as the wheels left the ground, and for just a moment allowed herself to remember what flying used to feel like, before it became something she had to explain, justify, and beg permission for. 14 years ago, the name Phoenix had meant something different entirely. Captain Renee Ashworth had been one of the most decorated fighter pilots in her wing, the kind of pilot instructors used as an example, the kind other aviators requested by name when the missions got dangerous enough that skill was the only thing standing between success and catastrophe. She'd flown missions she couldn't speak about to anyone in places officially marked as elsewhere on maps, and she'd brought every member of her flight home every single time. Her call sign had been earned the hard way. After a mission where her aircraft took catastrophic damage, she'd nursed it back to base on a wing in prayer, refusing to eject even when command ordered her to. You rose out of that wreckage like something that wasn't supposed to survive. her wing commander had told her afterward. The name Phoenix stuck immediately, and for years. It opened doors, earned salutes, meant something in rooms full of people who didn't hand out respect easily. Then came the mission that ended everything. She'd witnessed something during a classified operation, a decision made above her pay grade that got people killed, a decision someone powerful needed buried. When she refused to stay silent, refused to sign paperwork that rewrote what had actually happened, the machinery of consequence moved fast and quiet. Charges were filed under vague national security language. Her clearance vanished overnight. Her wings were grounded, and somewhere in a database she'd never see, her name was quietly flagged as a restricted individual. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she'd refused to lie about who had. No court, no public hearing, just erasure. Her father had been the only person who never once doubted her. "You did the right thing," he'd told her, the night she'd shown up at his door with nothing but a duffel bag and a career in ruins. The truth doesn't need a courtroom to still be true. He'd said it every year since, on the anniversary of the day she lost her wings, like a small, stubborn ritual neither of them ever named out loud. Now he was gone, and she was flying to bury him under the same restriction that had buried her career. Silent, unable to explain herself to a terminal full of strangers, carrying a truth that still, after all these years, nobody official wanted to hear. She hadn't expected the sky to still feel like home the moment the wheels left the ground, but it did. It always had. 30 minutes into the flight, cruising smoothly at 37,000 feet, something in the cabin's rhythm changed. Renee felt it before she understood it. A shift in the pitch of the engines, subtle enough that most passengers wouldn't register it consciously, but her ears had spent too many years trained on exactly this kind of sound. She glanced up from the window, instincts sharpening without her permission. Dana moved past twice in quick succession, her earlier easy composure replaced by something tighter, more clipped. She exchanged a brief urgent word with another flight attendant near the forward galley, both of them glancing toward the cockpit door with expressions that didn't match routine turbulence protocol. The captain's voice came over the PA, and immediately Renee noted the difference. His tone from the pre-flight announcement had been smooth, almost bored with routine. This time it carried a thin edge of strain he wasn't quite managing to hide. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Owens. We're experiencing a minor technical issue in the cockpit. Nothing to be alarmed about. Please remain seated with your belts fastened." Minor. Renee's jaw tightened at the word. She'd heard enough emergency communications in her career to recognize the particular strain of a pilot choosing his words carefully to avoid triggering panic, which meant, almost certainly, that the situation was worse than minor. A businessman 2 rows up muttered to his seatmate about turbulence. A mother across the aisle gripped her toddler's hand a little tighter, her own smile faltering. Renee's eyes tracked the flight attendant's movements with growing unease. Dana disappeared toward the front of the cabin and didn't return for almost 5 full minutes, an eternity in the compressed timeline of an in-flight emergency. When she finally reappeared, her face had lost most of its color. The intercom crackled again, and this time there was no attempt to soften anything. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Owens. We have a serious medical emergency in the cockpit. First Officer Danvers is unconscious. I'm not feeling well myself. We are declaring an emergency." The cabin erupted into a low, rolling wave of panic. Gasps, a child crying, someone praying audibly 2 rows back. Renee sat perfectly still for exactly 1 second, feeling the old, familiar clarity settle over her like a second skin. Then she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The aisle had turned into a river of fear. Passengers half standing, flight attendants moving with barely controlled urgency, the low murmur of panic rising toward something louder. Renee moved against it all, walking forward with the kind of steady purpose that made people instinctively step aside without knowing why. She found Dana near the forward galley, phone in hand, face pale. "I can help," Renee said, voice low but absolutely certain. "I'm a pilot, extensive experience. I need cockpit access now." Dana's eyes widened. Recognition flickering, then hesitation, the restriction list surfacing in her memory like a slow-rising tide. I can't just..." She glanced toward the cockpit door, then back at Renee, caught between protocol and the growing certainty that protocol wasn't built for a moment like this. "I have to call it in. I can't override that on my own." "Then call it in," Renee said. "Tell them Renee Ashworth. Call sign Phoenix. They'll verify me faster than you think." Dana hesitated 1 more second. 1 second that felt impossibly long, before lifting the interphone and relaying the name to air traffic control with a shaking voice. Behind the cockpit door, muffled sounds confirmed what Renee already suspected. A groan, something heavy, shifting. The captain's voice, thinner now, trying and failing to maintain the composure required to fly 180 people safely through the sky. Somewhere over Nebraska, 2 F-22 Raptors were already screaming off the runway at Buckley Space Force Base, scrambled the moment the emergency call reached military air traffic control. Major Cole Whitfield led the formation, Captain Sophia Reyes on his wing, both climbing hard toward intercept altitude with no idea yet what, or who, was waiting for them. Dana pressed the phone tighter to her ear, listening to a controller relay information to someone on the military side. Her expression shifted from confusion to something closer to disbelief. "They're asking me to confirm," she said, turning back to Renee, voice barely above a whisper. "They're asking if you said Phoenix." Renee held her gaze, steady, unflinching, years of buried identity rising back to the surface in a single word. "Yes," she said. "Tell them exactly that." Dana relayed it, and on the other end of that call, in a control tower 2 states away, the response that came back would change everything happening on this aircraft in the next 60 seconds. The silence on the radio lasted only a heartbeat, but it felt endless. "Say again," Major Cole Whitfield transmitted, his voice suddenly taut with disbelief as his Raptor cut through the thin morning air. "Confirm the name." "Renee Ashworth," the controller repeated. "Call sign Phoenix. She's requesting cockpit access aboard Flight 2Y9. Whitfield's breath caught behind his oxygen mask. Every fighter pilot who'd come up through the last decade of Air Force training had heard the name Phoenix whispered in briefing rooms. A legend half buried under classified paperwork. A pilot whose career had ended in circumstances nobody fully explained, but everyone quietly respected. Phoenix Mitchell." "Ashworth is cleared," he said, and there was something almost reverent in his voice now. "Cleared for immediate cockpit access, full authority. She is one of the finest tactical aviators this country has ever trained. Give her whatever she needs." In the galley, Dana lowered the phone slowly, staring at Renee like she was seeing an entirely different person standing in front of her. "They said," Dana swallowed, "they said give you whatever you need." Renee didn't wait for further permission. She moved to the cockpit door as Dana unlocked it with hands that weren't quite steady, and stepped inside to a scene that confirmed every instinct that had been screaming at her since the engines first changed pitch. Captain Owens was slumped forward, breathing shallow, sweat beading on a face gone gray. First Officer Danvers lay unconscious against the side panel, oxygen mask askew. Hypoxia. A pressurization malfunction, most likely, starving the cockpit of oxygen slowly enough that neither man had recognized what was happening to them until it was too late to stop it. Renee slid into the left seat, and for the first time in years, her hands closed around aircraft controls that responded to her exactly the way she remembered. Familiar, immediate, alive under her fingers. She adjusted the pressurization system first, restoring proper oxygen flow, then keyed the radio with a calm that belied everything she was feeling underneath. "Denver Center, this is Flight 219. Captain Renee Ashworth assuming emergency control. Both pilots incapacitated. Receiving oxygen now. Request vectors back to Chicago." A new voice crackled through, closer now, unmistakably a fighter pilot's clipped cadence. "Flight 219, this is Whitfield. Visual contact established. Phoenix, it's an honor. You have tactical authority. We'll bring you home." The 737 felt heavier than anything Renee had flown in years, sluggish compared to the razor-edge responsiveness of an F-22, but her hands adjusted instinctively, finding the rhythm of an aircraft built for stability rather than speed. She banked into a gentle turn toward Chicago, monitoring the instruments with the same fierce concentration she'd once reserved for combat. Behind her, Dana worked quickly to get oxygen masks properly seated on both incapacitated pilots, her earlier fear replaced now by focused determination. "Captain Owens is coming around," she called out. "He's breathing easier." "Keep the mask on him," Renee said, eyes never leaving the instrument panel. "Don't let him try to talk yet." Through the cockpit window, she caught sight of the two Raptors sliding into formation, one off each wing. Not threatening this time, but protective, an honor guard escorting her home instead of intercepting her. The sight sent something unexpected through her chest, a feeling she hadn't let herself access in years. "Phoenix, Whitfield," came the radio call. "You're clear all the way to O'Hare. We've got priority handling, emergency vehicles standing by. How's your patient status?" "First officer's still out," Renee replied, checking the readouts. "Captain, stabilizing. I need a smooth approach, no surprises." "Copy that. We'll clear your path." Turbulence rattled the aircraft briefly as they descended through a cloud layer, and Renee felt Captain Owens stir behind her, groggy but conscious enough to mumble something incoherent. Dana reassured him gently, keeping him calm and still, while Renee focused entirely on the controls. Air traffic control began feeding her sequenced instructions, adjusting the airliner's path through increasingly crowded airspace as controllers rerouted other traffic to clear priority space for the emergency descent. Renee absorbed each instruction with practiced efficiency, translating decades-old fighter pilot reflexes into the language of commercial aviation without missing a beat. "Ashworth, Denver Center, you're looking good. Wind's calm. Runway 28 is yours whenever you're ready." She glanced once more at the instruments, then out toward the two Raptors still flanking her, wingtips steady in perfect formation. For a moment, despite everything, despite the restriction list, the humiliation at the gate, the years of buried identities, she allowed herself to feel something close to peace. "Denver Center, Flight 219. beginning final approach. The city skyline emerged through scattered clouds ahead, runway lights already blinking to life in the distance, waiting. The runway grew steadily larger through this windshield, a long gray ribbon flanked by flashing emergency lights and waiting vehicles. Renee's hands stayed steady on the controls, despite the accumulated tension of the last 20 minutes. Every instinct she'd honed across a decade of high-stakes flying converging into this single, critical approach. Flight 219, you're cleared to land, runway 28, the tower confirmed. Emergency crews standing by. Behind her, Captain Owens had regained enough awareness to watch weakly from his seat, unable to help, but conscious enough to recognize skill when he saw it. "Who?" he managed, voice hoarse. "Later," Renee said gently, not unkindly. "Right now, just breathe." The Raptors peeled away as she crossed the threshold, their job complete, leaving her alone with the aircraft for the final seconds of the approach. She flared at exactly the right moment, easing the massive jet down onto the runway with a smoothness that belied everything chaotic that had happened in the hour before. Wheels touched. Reverse thrusters roared to life, and the aircraft decelerated steadily, rolling toward the waiting cluster of emergency vehicles, with their lights painting the runway in flashing red and blue. The cabin, silent with tension moments before, erupted into spontaneous applause. Somewhere behind her, Renee heard someone crying with relief, another passenger laughing in disbelief. The little girl who'd asked why the lady needed a guard was now asking her mother, in the same piercing voice, if that lady was the one who saved them. As the aircraft rolled to a stop and ground crews swarmed to assist the incapacitated pilots, Renee finally allowed her shoulders to drop, the accumulated adrenaline of the last hour finally beginning to drain from her system. Outside, she caught sight of two figures crossing the tarmac in flight suits. Major Whitfield and Captain Reyes, moving with the unmistakable bearing of pilots approaching someone they deeply respected. When the cockpit door opened and Renee stepped down onto the tarmac, Whitfield snapped into a crisp salute. "Captain Ashworth," he said, voice thick with genuine emotion. "Phoenix, on behalf of every fighter pilot who ever heard your name in a briefing room. Thank you." Renee returned the salute, feeling something long buried finally begin to surface. Recognition, vindication, and something that felt, for the first time in years, like coming home. The tarmac was chaos in the organized way emergencies always are. Paramedics loading Captain Owens and First Officer Danvers onto stretchers, both men conscious now and stable. Investigators already beginning to document what had gone wrong with the pressurization system. Passengers filed off the aircraft in small, shaken groups, many pausing to thank Renee directly, some simply staring at her with expressions of stunned gratitude. Dana approached last, exhaustion evident on her face, but her eyes warm. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For hesitating back there, I didn't know." "You didn't need to know," Renee said. "You made the call. That's what mattered." Major Whitfield lingered nearby, clearly reluctant to leave without saying more. "I already put in a call to my commanding officer," he admitted. "What happened here today, it's going to get attention. The right kind this time." He wasn't wrong. By the time Renee reached the terminal, her phone, returned to her by an apologetic airline representative, was already flooding with notifications. Someone on the flight had filmed the applause as she stepped off the aircraft. Another passenger had overheard Whitfield's salute and posted it with the caption, "Grounded Hero Saves Flight." By evening, her name was trending nationally, paired with old, half-forgotten stories about a fighter pilot whose career had ended under mysterious circumstances years earlier. Reporters began calling within hours. Renee ignored most of them, focused instead on getting to Newark a day later than planned, finally standing at her father's graveside with a chapter of her life reopened in ways she hadn't expected. 3 days after the incident, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. General Thomas Cade, Air Force Chief of Staff, introduced himself personally, his voice carrying an authority that made the years of silence between them feel suddenly very small. "Captain Ashworth," he said, "I've reviewed your file, all of it. What happened to you should never have happened, and I intend to make that right. The restriction list, the frozen clearance, the years of quiet erasure, all of it," he explained, "would be reversed. Fully, publicly, unambiguously." Renee sat by her father's grave that evening, phone still warm in her hand, feeling something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Relief, vindication, and underneath it, quietly, hope. 2 weeks later, Renee stood on a familiar runway in her dress uniform, sunlight glinting off insignia she'd once thought she'd never wear again. A small crowd had gathered. Fellow pilots, family, a handful of young aviators who'd asked specifically to attend once word spread about who she was and what she'd endured. General Cade himself pinned her wings back onto her uniform, his handshake firm, his words simple. "Welcome back, Captain." Afterward, a young woman in an Air Force ROTC uniform approached, hesitant but determined, eyes shining with something Renee recognized instantly, the particular hunger of someone who needed proof that excellence couldn't be permanently erased by people determined to bury it. "You showed us," the young woman said quietly, "that being right doesn't always feel like winning, but it still matters." Renee didn't have a perfect response. She simply nodded, understanding completely. 6 months later, she climbed into an F-22 cockpit for the first time in years, hands finding controls that felt immediately like coming home. Major Whitfield flew as her wingman, and after they landed, he offered a crisp salute through the canopy glass. "Welcome home, Phoenix," he said. "The sky missed you." Renee sat there a long moment, engines winding down around her, and looked up at the vast blue stretching endlessly overhead, the same sky that had once been taken from her by people who mistook silence for surrender. She thought about her father, about the words he'd repeated every year without fail. The truth doesn't need a courtroom to still be true. He'd been right, in the end. It had just taken the world a little longer to catch up. Being grounded, she realized, had never actually been about the restriction list, or the years of humiliation at gates and checkpoints. It had been about whether she'd let other people's fear define who she was. She hadn't. Not really. Not when it counted. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the world to recognize what they always knew about themselves. Renee had learned that recognition, however sweet, was never the point. The truth had been there all along. In her hands, in her training, in every quiet act of integrity that cost her everything and gave it all back in the end. Legends don't stay grounded forever. They rise again, stronger, vindicated, and exactly where they were always meant to be. If the story moved you, hit like, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always finds its way back to the sky.